I'm Alexander Muscat. I'm from RMIT University in Melbourne. I'm currently doing my PhD studies into narrative design in digital games. And today I'm going to be talking about the video game Arma 3 and its very detailed, broad and diverse, but also problematic representation of combat and war and how we might improve on it. So, since 2001, the Czech studio Bohemia Interactive has been developing its series of milsim games that have sold well enough to continue the series, for over a decade. And these games have a very intense focus on authentic infantry combat from the first person, as well as displaying a breadth of combined arms. And there's this kind of encompassing philosophy in these games for a aim for realism, but balancing it for gameplay purposes. And this was true in the third game in the series that I'll be talking about, Arma 3, which is the first to be set in the future, the year 2035. Even though it's a science fiction setting, it's not nanomachines and exoskeletons. Rather, it's combat as we know it today, only there's a few more drones and some soldiers wear like army Google glasses, basically. So this is a very conservative depiction of future war, and that kind of reflects on this kind of authentic and realistic philosophy they're going for. And this is also true in how the Spirit series has been spun off and sold to various armed forces around the world under the title Virtual Battlespace, which is used for military training. I think the Australian Armed Forces use it. I know the American Marines do. So that kind of gives you an idea of the authenticity going on. So to kind of boil down to what you do in Arma 3, you play as a NATO soldier. I'll be focusing primarily on the single-player content of this game. You play as a NATO soldier in the middle of an escalating conflict on some Greek islands against an invading force, only known as CSAT. What they are most identifiable for is their use of like future Warsaw Pact / Russian weapons. And yeah, the player engages basically in a wide range of infantry combat from the first person, sometimes fighting under the command of AI soldiers, sometimes on their own, running from the enemy or behind enemy lines, and sometimes you're actually commanding soldiers yourself. What Arma 3 does is it does away with specifically designed levels that we find in video games. Usually the combat area or like a city has been curated and designed specifically to elicit a certain kind of combat experience. And that's not true in Arma. Instead, the terrain has been designed very realistically. It takes place over two very large islands. And the mission design is quite open-ended. And this is a very systematic game in that you have a lot of choice in how you go about missions and navigate the terrain and engage in combat, as well as there's a lot of variability in how combat plays out. So no two firefights are the same. And this lends to a real sense of unpredictability and danger when in combat, which really enhances the gameplay experience and drives home this feeling of authenticity and realism, even though there are some compromises for gameplay purposes. So, what the backbone is to this game is this ridiculous level of detail that is really unlike any other game. So things like ballistics are very realistically modeled. Bullets will pass through certain objects, they'll pass through bodies certain ways, they'll dip, they'll curve, it's kind of scary. Any object in the game can be interacted with and can be picked up. You can pick things up off a body, you can pick things up off the ground, you can place things, you can put them in your backpack and so on. And there's a very detailed movement system. The body of your character behaves quite like the human body would. It becomes fatigued, it can be positioned and moved in different ways. And interestingly, your head moves independently to your actual body, unlike most other games. So you can be walking in one direction and looking over your shoulder. And you can even look at things like your watch and maps and so on. And what this scope and breadth and this intense detail gives us is this interesting perspective on how these different compounding mechanisms that make up combat work together. Which is quite different to most games, and it gives us also gives the player a high degree of agency, which is interesting. However, if this sounds all a bit kind of porny to you, then you'd be right, because there is a massive focus in these games on emphasizing this detail, and this is really evident in its showcasing of arms and weapons. So there are features in the game where you can dress up your soldier in different ways, and you can dress up your gun in different ways. And this leads to a very strong fetishization of war. which kind of dips into the uncanny territory. This is also true in the way that war plays out and combat plays out. It's a very idealistic representation of combat in Arma 3, even though one bullet may kill somebody. For instance, the setup is that you have two technologically equal sides fighting each other across what is essentially a clean and tasteful conflict. There may be large body counts for soldiers, but there's no gratuitous violence and maiming. There's no real trauma, no PTSD or anything like that. Civilians basically don't exist. They're window dressing, sparingly used, don't matter to the plot, and or of little relevance to anything. And the same can be said for things like towns and buildings. You can level buildings, you can run a tank into a house and bring it down. However, that doesn't count for anything. It's just a building gone. And while Arma 3 actually does obey the rules of war, so if you shoot a friendly combatant, your combatants will actually turn on you, and the red cross is proudly displayed as well, and you can't interfere with that, and you can't wear an enemy's uniform as well. It doesn't really it doesn't really come into practice at all as part of the gameplay. It's kind of just there as this auxiliary thing, and this leads to this really weird, uncanny representation of war, which is probably the most evident in its depiction of soldiers and combatants. So soldiers in Arma 3 are very highly detailed characters. They look like real people, they blink, they move their faces, they move their mouths. They can do all the same things the player can. They can pick up objects, put down objects, and so on. They're also quite intelligent by video game standards. They can hear, they can see. They have a bunch of states to how they respond to firefights and so on. However, they're all named by their class, and their class is defined by their proficiency, which is usually what gun they carry and usually how they go about combat. So in this scene on the right, all these soldiers are called riflemen, medic, marksman, auto rifleman, etc., except for the one guy in the middle who actually has a name. And I can't remember his name because he, like all the other characters as part of Arma 3, who do have titles, are all adhere to the same military stereotype, which is nose to the grindstone soldier who gets the job done, shoots the bad guys, and if his comrades die, doesn't really bat an eyelid. And this is a really big problem because these characters don't show distress. They don't have any banter or dialogue with each other between missions or in missions, and there's no psychological effects aren't present either. And soldiers get shot, soldiers die, soldiers get wounded, however, and body trauma happens a lot. However, it's also unacknowledged by the characters and as part of the gameplay in the as missions progress. And those unnamed soldiers, those riflemen, those medics and everything, they're replaced from mission to mission. If they die, it doesn't matter. They're effectively expendable assets. And this kind of gives us a very utilitarian view of what soldiers are, despite this kind of authentic slant. And this is far from the truth. You can look at films like Breast Repo, and to a lesser extent the film Armadillo. And these are films that have embedded documentary filmmakers who go with the soldiers into the field and actually spend time with them on their fire bases in Afghanistan. And these filmmakers put a heavy focus on the soldiers to try and portray a truthful and honest account of the war experience. And this is the idea to start a discussion point about the war from, representing from focusing on the soldiers. And through these films, it makes it very hard to sympathize, hard not to sympathize with the soldiers' frustrations and relate to them and imagine yourself in their shoes and in this situation. And this is where I think there is a massive missed opportunity in a game like Arma 3 that has this very authentic and detailed approach at a technical level to war, but then is also quite imbalanced and soulless, and also leads to some sort of detached fantasy about what war is and what combat is and what it is to be a soldier, where it could be adjusted and changed to be something more believable and more personal and authentic beyond just ballistics. And a game like this could perhaps help us build a stronger understanding of the complexities of wartime from a soldier's perspective, and then help us then branch out onto broader ethical questions of combat and war, and then ideally teach players, about themes beyond your regular Call of Duty and, military or tactical shooter war games. So A great way of doing this is by focusing on the story in a game. And games have, of course, been having a swing, hit and miss at story for a very long time, like Metal Gear Solid, which is a great and a weird game in itself. And games have always have continuously tried to represent soldiers and themes of war as well as part of their stories. So looking at some good pre-existing examples, I'll try and suggest how you can adapt these to a game like Arma 3 to kind of create more believable soldiers and a more believable representation of war. So the first is better dialogue. Even if it's fiction, you need to give reasons for players to care. So more often than not, the characters to the story and the characters in this fictional universe are our anchors. And as Kurt Vonnegut said in his tips about writing, that every sentence must do one of two things, either reveal character or advance the action. And in games, we mainly focus on advancing the action, almost militantly at times. And revealing character and focusing on character can lead to, ideally, some more dialogue and more characterization and personalization, not just in combat, but outside of combat. And a few good examples, of course, are Spec Ops, the Brothers in Arms series, and surprisingly, the game Star Wars Republic Commando, which involves literal clone soldiers who actually have personalities, which is kind of ironic. Another great technique is use of framing. So often in games, we're infatuated with a certain kind of perspective. In Arma 3, it's the first-person perspective, and the game very strictly adheres to everything taking place in first person. If you're not on a menu, you're in first person as a character on the battlefield, walking around. And the game is essentially a slave to this perspective. For better or for worse, games like Call of Duty, while the game takes place mostly in first person, it makes liberal use of cutscenes, and there's quite a lot of other games out there that also do. And this gives us a much more broader overview of different parts of conflict, of a conflict, war, a scenario, as well as characters, and more interesting ways to characterize, your characters and give them personality. Another thing is using character vignettes, and not many games do this, but the game Halo ODST does, which involves a recurring cast of characters who have their own subplots as part of an interconnected narrative. And this is great because it doesn't compromise the gameplay, but it allows the player to roleplay as different characters who are all soldiers, but doing different things at different times, and kind of understand their character and their personality and kind of get invested in this overarching narrative and theme of an alien invasion. Another thing is making things visible. So in games like the old Rainbow Six games, XCOM and Jagged Alliance, you have character rosters. And the characters are usually given quite an intense backstory and detail, or the ability for the player to kind of customize them and kind of project a bit of themselves into the characters. So by kind of surfacing these character details, and we can kind of get the player to attach with them in different ways outside of the typical gameplay loop, which would be combat. Also, permanence, I think, is quite important, because having a character like the one on the bottom left here, who is effectively a statistic sheet with a background, die during combat has a repercussion because that character is dead for the rest of the game. So while they are given very little character in a literary sense, and they're more or less an asset, the realities of war do strike home to a certain extent, and that's quite important, especially when you're naming your soldier auto rifleman and machine gunner and so on. Oh, cool. And finally, I think we should pay more attention to the affordances in a game, especially in a game like Arma 3, which has this incredible scope of interaction. I think there's opportunities for players to use these outside of the pure utility, which is shooting stuff. We can give these items and these objects that the player interacts with, as well as their body, for instance, a bit more character. And we can make it speak for the character you're playing as and the characters you're alongside of. And a great example of this, and it's really weird to talk about this in a military context, is the game Gone Home, which has the player picking up objects in a house and studying them at close detail in order to learn about the inhabitants of it and basically uncover the story. And I don't see why in a game like Arma you can't have, a notebook or be picking up journals or reading journals or have, these other extra bits that are part of the gameplay mechanics that give you character or tell you something about who you're playing as. And a great example of this, of like how all these things can kind of connect together and give you this interesting suspension of disbelief, is the game, or the series Stalker, which is a science fiction series, but it allows the player this high level of interaction like Arma, only it all plays towards uncovering the story, where you pick items off characters and read notes and basically uncover the plot through gameplay mechanisms and learn a bit more about the characters and the setting, which helps with our suspension of disbelief. So in a nutshell, thank you very much, and yeah.